Um, we spent 2 lectures kind of talking about the nuts and bolts or the fundamentals of the leading rating systems. Now we're going to get into the some of the strategies that we would employ to what are some of the green building strategies, right? So before we talked about how the rating system works, and now we're going to talk about some of the things that we might do to make our buildings more efficient, right? Remember, our goal here is to reduce the human use of resources throughout the construction process. So we're going to talk about density and land use and how it impacts sustainability. What we'll see is that where a building is located can have a lot to do with how green or how sustainable it is, right? Where a building is located is very important, right? Because that, once you build the building, then it's there for a long period of time. So where we decide to build the building and where we build in relation to other structures, is a key component of sustainability. So I'm going to, in some of my materials here, I'm going to draw upon some work that this group called the CNT, or Center for Neighborhood Technology. This is a not-for-profit in the sustainability space. They actually are located here in Chicago. I actually worked at CNT many years ago, early in my career. So they had some materials that kind of explain this concept of location efficiencies. So I'm going to use this to explain some ideas about how location matters in terms of the efficiency or sustainability of buildings, right? So we are all, or probably on some level, familiar with the energy efficiency of a building, right? We know that if a building uses less energy, if it's more efficient in that regard, then it's greener or more sustainable. But we should also think about the neighborhood or the urban design being efficient as well, right? So if we have compact neighborhoods that are walkable, where we have access to public transportation, where jobs are close at hand, where we have mixed land uses, and we'll see what that means. This particular type of urban design can be location efficient, right? So this type of design lends itself to lower transportation costs, lower energy usage related to transportation. And that helps us in our buildings being more sustainable. Right, if we live in a location efficient neighborhood, right, then we may be spending less time and less money and producing less CO2 and meeting our everyday travel needs. So what I'm going to try to do here is have us think more broadly about the CO2 or the carbon impacts of buildings, right? We think we're likely to think about the CO2 or the carbon or the energy impact of the heating and the cooling and the lighting of the building. But we should also think about the impacts, the travel impacts of all the people traveling to and from that building. So putting a very efficient building out on the outer edge of Chicagoland that building itself might be efficient, but if everyone has to drive to get to the building, then maybe it wasn't the right place to build the building. That's what we're talking about here. So if we either choose to live or we design our communities such that folks have easy access to jobs and transportation, right? We can provide savings, right? Savings in the cost of transportation and also greenhouse gas savings, right? If we don't have to get in the car to do everything, we don't have to get in the car all the time, right? That's both reducing costs and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, right? If we are able to create neighborhoods and cities that are location efficient, then folks aren't necessarily reliant on having to get in their car and to meet their everyday needs. Right? That's what we're talking about. So again, on this, and I have the link to the CNT website. It's basically looking at annual driving costs or annual transportation expenses, and you see that the green is good, green is lower cost, lower expenses, and yellow and red are progressive orange, yellow, red, or yellow, orange, red is progressively higher. And you see as you move further and further out from the city, transportation costs increase, automobile costs increase, right? Because if you're closer into the city and you might have access to mass transportation, things are closer together, you don't necessarily have to drive to meet your everyday needs, right? That's the point that this website and this analysis is trying to show. Right, as we zoom further out, we see that when we get out to the outer ring suburbs, further away from the city center, those costs of driving become higher and higher, and the greenhouse gas emissions would be higher and higher as well, right? Because you're out in St. Charles or some of these areas, you pretty much have to get in your car to do anything, right? This view looks at greenhouse gas emissions. The colors have changed, but this is greenhouse gas emission per household. Again, the lighter tans are lower, and the darker colors are, that would be tons, T-O-N-N-E-S, or metric tons per household. And again, the colors have shifted, but the same holds true. Again, as you're closer to the center of the city, your greenhouse gas emissions are lower because you are, in all likelihood, more likely to have public transportation available to you, and less likely to have to get in your car all the time to do things. Bea, that is a great question. Yes, that is true. You have to look at the balance of both of those things. We'll get to that point in a minute. Again, I think that not to give away the punchline here, but I think the CNT folks are asking that you consider both of those things together, right? We'll in a minute, spoiler alert, we'll get to something called the H&T index, housing plus transportation. They're essentially encouraging you to look at both of those things. So it might turn out that yes, your rent is higher, but your transportation costs are lower, and overall you're better off. But yes, you have to look at both of those things. right? So when we think of cities and their greenhouse gas emissions, GHG, greenhouse gas, I should have spelled that out, sorry. So we tend to think of cities as being places of high greenhouse gas emissions, and that's true, right? Because we have a density there, we have lots of buildings, we have lots of tall buildings. So yes, on a per area basis, per land area basis, cities have high greenhouse gas emissions. But if we look at it on a per capita basis, right, per person or per household, cities generally have a much lower greenhouse gas usage, right? Because in the city, we are less likely, we have more access to transportation, to public transportation, and less likely to have to get in our car to meet our everyday travel needs. So what are some of the things that figure into this? So we'll go through each of these factors. Density, right? How many shops and houses and buildings are in the same area of land, right? That's density. The availability of public transportation. We'll talk about mixed land uses, and we'll talk about zoning, right? So we're trying to see how all these things feed into transportation energy usage in a city. Right? I think I know one of you chose this book, so I'm kind of cribbing some ideas from this particular author. It was on my list of recommended reading. But yeah, so density means that there's a lot more stores and services that are available nearby. And perhaps distances are shorter, so it's possible to walk places, right? You can potentially walk to the grocery store, walk to the dry cleaner, right? Things that you can do potentially in a city or in a denser area that you don't necessarily get to do if you're further out in the suburbs, right? That is one of the benefits of living in a dense urban area. Right? Obviously, there are perhaps some downsides, but these are some of the benefits. Obviously, in a urban area, we have the availability of public transportation, and obviously having a certain amount of density of people allows us to have public transportation, and those people using public transportation kind of supports its frequency, right? The bus runs. Frequency means how often does the bus run, how often does the train run, and this is these things reinforce each other, right? If you have good access to transit and the bus runs frequently, then people are more likely to be able to want to get on the bus, right? If the bus comes once every half an hour, that might be hard for you to, excuse me, take the bus because you're like, oh geez, that's half an hour is a long time to wait, right? If I miss my bus, I got to wait a half an hour for the next bus, right? So if I have a choice, excuse me, maybe I'm going to get in my car. If the bus runs more frequently, then you're more likely, or the L runs more frequently, right? You're more likely to choose that mode of transportation as opposed to getting in your automobile, right? What we'll see here is that the people who are designing, urban designers and planners, right, they're going to try to do things to make it more likely that you're going to choose transit, public transportation to get around than the automobile. right, I happen to find this right, what density does it take to support public transportation? How many dwelling units per acre do we need to have enough people to support public transportation, right? The idea here is that if there's more potential transit riders, then it's more likely that someone is gonna run a bus line or L line to serve you. Right, so I found the statistic here, 9 to 12 dwelling units per acre is about where public transportation starts to make sense, right? So what does that look like? Well, I actually, this is me standing on my front porch looking at the houses across the street from me, right? I live in Southeast Oak Park. You know, we're in a older inner ring suburb, you know, bungalows on 25-foot lots. So we have about 14 dwelling units an acre. So we're at a place where public transportation begins to make sense. And, you know, we in Southeast Oak Park are lucky enough to have the blue, at least where I live, right? Lucky enough to have the blue line that runs fairly close to our house. So people in my neighborhood, if they work downtown, have the option of taking public transportation to work, right? That's a great attribute of the community that I live in. Right? It was in my last job when I worked downtown, it was great for me. You know, 2 jobs ago, yes, that is correct. Yeah, Ayana, you're in the real estate business, so yes. Houses closer to transportation, it increases their value. So, you know, the other thing that in our case, right, someone who owns a home and someone that's looking to buy a home always have a different point of view. In the case of my wife and I, right, we own our home, so the fact that the value of our house is going up because we're close to public transportation and have a good school nearby, right? That's good for us. But yes, in this case, right, years and years ago, I had a job where I worked out in the suburbs, and I got in my car every day and I spent, you know, when it got to be an hour each way getting to and from work, I finally said, this is dumb. I'm wasting a lot of my time, and I quit that job and I found a new job working downtown where I could walk 2 blocks and get on the blue line here and go downtown. So, but that was possible because the neighborhood that I live in has enough dwelling units, enough density to allow for to allow and support public transportation. Yes, good observation, Ayana. So let's talk about mixed land uses, right? So mixed land, you know, we have different things that different types of buildings that can be built on the same property, right? We can have residential, we can have commercial, we can have multifamily, right? So mixed land uses means that those residential and commercial uses are adjacent to each other or in close proximity. Separation of uses means that residential and commercial are geographically separated from each other. So having that separation of uses makes this concept of location efficiency more difficult to achieve, right? These decisions about what gets built where, land use policies, those are planning decisions that are made at the level of an individual municipality, so they can make this location efficiency. They can either foster it, make it more likely to happen, or inhibit it, make it less likely to happen, right? So what does mixed use look like? again, for those of us who maybe live in the city or one of the inner ring suburbs, right? This is an apartment building with shops on the ground floor, right? This is mixed use, right? We have residential and commercial uses that are adjacent or in close proximity to each other, right? This is a couple blocks away from where I live, right? I'm just on the south side of the Eisenhower, so when I walk across the Eisenhower, right, I see things like this in my neighborhood, right? I see an apartment building that has stores on the ground floor, right? So I think it's not anymore, but this used to be the pet food store, right? So if I wanted to get food for the cat, then I could walk a couple blocks to the pet food store. I didn't have to get in my car, right? That's mixed use, right? Here's another, again, this is in my same neighborhood, right? This is mixed use, right? We have residential and commercial uses that are adjacent or in close proximity to each other, right? These are some houses. This is I guess now a pie shop, right? Somebody renovated this strip of properties. So now our neighborhood here, we've got this row of businesses, a pie shop, and a few other things. I think there's a bar and a restaurant there now, right? You always got to have a bar in your neighborhood. Right, this is what separation of uses looks like. Right, I believe this is the Jewel that's on North Avenue, just south of where Triton is. So in this case, we have residential and commercial uses in geographically separate and distinct areas. So again, a couple years ago when I was putting this slide together, by the way, I like Oak Park. Fred, my wife and I have lived here for, I don't know, 30 some years. So it's worked out very well for us. You know, Oak Park has good, had great schools. Our children got a great education here. As I say, and currently I worked for a while in a job where I could take the Blue Line downtown. That worked out well for me. Right now I work from home like lots of people. So, my commute is walking down the hallway from my bedroom to my home office. But yeah, Oak Park has been a great place for us. So this is these are some pictures from, I think this is Melrose Park, right nearby Triton, right? So I think this is the Jewel, just on the south side of North Avenue, just west of Fifth Avenue, right? I drove around one day to try to see what these things look like. So these are the residential neighborhoods that, as the crow flies, between the Jewel Osco and these houses, as the crow flies, is probably perhaps a quarter of a mile, if not probably less than that. But you see that these are kind of separate and distinct from each other, right? The commercial and the residential are separate from each other. So if you happen to live in this house here, yeah, I guess theoretically you could walk, you could walk to the Jewel to do your grocery shopping. But it's far more likely that you're going to get in your car and do your grocery shopping, right? Because the people that laid out this town, they laid it out in the way that it's very difficult for you to walk from one place to another. Right? These are planning decisions that were made when this area was planned and developed. Right? So unfortunately, where I live, we used to have a grocery store right down at the end of my block. That store closed, so it's a little harder for me to to get my groceries now. Right now, it's a long walk to my food co-op. It used to be a short walk to the grocery store. So it's gotten a little harder for me, but at least theoretically, I can walk and do a lot of things. Whereas the folks that have chosen to live here in Melrose Park, there's almost nothing that they can walk to. And that's true of a lot of the suburbs in our geographic area, right? So how do those decisions get made? Well, those decisions about land use got made by what's called zoning. Right, zoning is a legislative, I think I say legislative process, but really it's a regulatory process that divides parcels of land up into different zones, residential, commercial, and industrial, according to specified land use, right? What can you do with that particular parcel of land? Then each of those zones is regulated in terms of its density, location, and the size and types of buildings that are permitted to be built there. So the idea here is we wanted to make sure that we didn't have houses and factories, houses that are doing, dangerous, smelly, noxious things. We didn't want to necessarily have those right next door to residences. So, there's some good points about having zoning. But the downside is if we separate things too much, then we see something like this, and zoning like this causes everyone to have to get in their car and when they need to go to the grocery store, which is something that concerns us now when we're looking to to reduce CO2, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, right? If everybody has to get in their car to go to a grocery store, that's something that we have to try to address. So typically, jurisdictions, I use the term jurisdiction to refer to a village or a town or a city, right? I live in the village of Oak Park. That's the jurisdiction that does the zoning. So typically they'll use R for residential, C for commercial, and I for industrial. And then they'll pair that with some kind of number, R1, R2. So that zoning will talk about things like, what uses are allowable in on that particular parcel. How tall can the building be? What the floor area ratio is. Floor area ratio is a ratio between the total square footage of the building and the total size of the lot. Setback has to do with how far the front and sides of the building have to be recessed or set back from the edge of the lot. Minimum lot size is parking spaces, right? So the way that all this stuff done, the way that essentially the rules, on one hand, zoning can limit, as I said, limit having a factory next door to my house, right, and preserve desirable residential characteristics, right? So I would be, I showed you that picture a minute ago of the houses across the street from me, right? All houses that look very similar to my house or to our house, right? That's nice. I wouldn't want to stand on my front porch and look out at a factory across the street from me, right? So in this case, zoning prevents that from happening. On the other hand, if we, as you'll see in a minute, if we go overboard, then we make it hard to get that density that's desirable to reduce transportation energy use. Right? This is a little hard to see, but in all likelihood, your jurisdiction, wherever you live, your town or village or city, will have a zoning map, and they'll typically have all the parcels broken up and they'll be color coded. Right, so right here's my house here, right here's the elementary school that my kids went to school at. Here's the park, here's the Blue Line stop. Right over the Eisenhower, here's this this mixed commercial and residential that I took some pictures of, right? So again, your town or village will have something like this that shows, what the land uses are in your area. And going along with it, they'll essentially have the rules regarding things like the minimum lot sizes and setbacks, building coverage, right? How much of the lot can the building cover? So again, we're starting to consider all these rules when we look at ways of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because we have to look for ways to increase density. Right? We'll see that. I don't know. We probably won't get to it tonight. We'll probably tackle it next week. Right? We'll see how these things start to fit together here between density and affordability and greenhouse gas. Right? If we make lots too big and too expensive, then it's hard for people to afford to live here. So these things fit together. Right, here's a map. Here is Wheaton. Right, Wheaton is a suburb further out west. Right, so all of a sudden you see again, this is R for residential. But the things you start to see as you get a little further out is these minimum lot sizes and the minimum lot width. Right, all of a sudden you're saying that to build in this neighborhood, right, you have a fairly large lot size. So all of a sudden you're saying two things. A, you're saying that maybe only people that are fairly wealthy can afford to live in Wheaton, right, because it has to be a fairly large lot, an expensive lot, right? So that's gonna impact affordability, and it's also going to impact density, right? With all these big lots, if you live here and you want to get to the grocery store, because all these lots are large, you all of a sudden have to get in your car, right? Just like we saw in Melrose Park. So again, we're starting to look at all these factors when we try to think about both sustainability and affordability. Let's just, I'll spend a couple more minutes here and then I'll let you go. Right, I wanted to take a little snapshots. This goes back to the annual driving costs from CNT. Right, I just wanted to see how those, as we move outward from the city center, how things change. Right, so if you're fortunate enough to live in Lincoln Park or can afford to live in Lincoln Park, right, Bea, you are correct that, an apartment in Lincoln Park is going to be expensive, but you don't necessarily have to have a car, right? You can live in Lincoln Park and not have a car because you have the CTA close by, you have, car share and bike share options, right? You have lots of, transportation options. So, maybe that rental in Lincoln Park, maybe that apartment that you rent there costs a little more, but if you don't need a car, maybe it's not such a bad deal after all. Right here is where I live in Oak Park. We're kind of on the transition. You know, we're an inner ring suburb. You see that our transportation costs, our driving costs are starting to increase. Right, green is good, yellow, brown, or yellow, orange, red. Right, we still have, you know, Oak Park is well served by transit. Right, we have a CTA and a Metra. So if you happen to live like I do right here by the Blue Line Austin stop, right, you see transportation costs in my little neighborhood are still pretty reasonable because probably a lot of people around by me can, you know, jump on the Blue Line and get to work. Get a little further out, here's Elmhurst. Right, Elmhurst has a nice, you know, it's served by a Metro stop. It does have a nice downtown area that's close to transit. But once you're a few blocks away from that Metro, then you're dependent on the automobile. And again, we work further out. Same thing in Naperville. Again, there is a Metro stop in Naperville. But lots and lots of folks in Naperville are going to rely on their automobile for transportation. Boom, and here we are, Elburn, right? This is a kind of on the edge of Chicagoland, right? Almost anything that you want to do in Elburn, you're going to have to get in your car to do it, right? The no little or no transportation because the density is low and everything is spread out. So why would people choose to live in Elburn? Well, probably one of the reasons they choose to live in Elburn is because they have to drive till you qualify, right? Ayana, you're in the real estate business, right? So we want housing costs not to exceed 30% of household income. So oftentimes families who are looking for an affordable house, they have to drive further out to an outer ring suburb to find a house that they can afford. Unfortunately, when they do that, they lose sight of the transportation costs, right? Yeah, we looked in the Sunday paper, nice house out in Elburn that we can afford. Wow, we can make the payments. Great thing, let's go move there, right? Well, unfortunately, right now that we're out in Elburn, we're going to get crushed with transportation costs because it's a long way from our job. It's a long way to the grocery store, right? There's nothing we can walk to. So this was, again, this was CNT's point of we need to look at both housing and transportation together, right? Yeah, we've gone out to the outer ring suburb to drive to qualify and you know, find inexpensive housing, but in the process we've driven up our transportation costs. So okay, well, sorry for keeping you a few minutes over time here. Any questions? Okay. Well, I will leave it at that. Again, thanks for doing the quiz. I just wanted to get a sense of where everyone is at. I probably should have done it earlier in the semester to kind of get through the the growing pains. I know I've been doing discussion boards where I post an article and then have you do stuff online. I'm going to try something a little different next week. At some point during the class next week, I'm gonna break you up into groups and let you discuss things amongst each other. I'm just trying to mix things up a little bit to